Well, welcome back to this edition of Keeping It Real with Alexander Garrett. And with me now is Jim Burling. He is with the Pacific Legal Foundation. First of all, James, you're the VP of Legal Affairs over there. Thanks for joining.
My pleasure.
And I know that you are, fighting the whole constitutional battle now is how do we reopen constitutionally? And my first question, though, is how much of an overreach have we seen that even you guys are fighting right now during coronavirus?
When this crisis first happened, everybody was in panic mode and nobody knew exactly what the extent of the virus was, how quickly it was going to destroy life as we know it on Earth. And so the reactions that were taken by government agencies were by and large constitutional for what we knew at the time, because local governments, governors, and have broad emergency powers. But the longer we go into this crisis, the more we learn about transmissibility, the more we learn about how some areas of the country are being affected versus others, the more we learn about what works as far as social distancing. A lot of the measures that were first put in place may have made sense back then, but they're making less and less sense in some states now. Not that some things ever made sense. When you have the governor of a state saying you can have sailboats and rowboats, but not motorboats, clearly that was completely irrational from the beginning. But quite clearly, it's time for the governors of the various states, and some are, and I give them credit for the thing, saying reassess. All right, we could stop everybody from getting sick from any transmissible disease if everybody were locked up in their homes forever. But then we'd all die of starvation, if not boredom and loneliness first. So we got to do better things about this. And it becomes irrational for some governors to continue the draconian lockdowns we've had in those areas where it's not required medically, but where we do know that the harms are so great. The Constitution says governments can't do things that are completely arbitrary, capricious, and irrational. And what may have been rational 2 months ago is oftentimes less and less rational today.
Well, and I'm just reading through you. You've actually won a case in the Supreme Court, Palazzolo versus Rhode Island. I'm sure that was cases back then aren't maybe as complex as they are right now, or what you've worked on before, are they more or less complex than what you're working on now with Corona?
No, I think there's equal degrees of complexity. The case that I had in Rhode Island, Palazzolo, that was about almost 20 years ago now. When I argued that, it dealt with property right issues that were very complex. What if you buy or acquire property that's already subject to regulations? Can you challenge those regulations in court? And the Supreme Court said yes, in an opinion by Justice Kennedy, agreeing with our side on that. So when you go to a court now, you have very similar constitutional issues as far as when can you sue the government? What can you sue the government over? Where do you sue the government? These are all basic fundamental questions that don't change, just the circumstances that surround the constitutional questions change. Now the circumstances, the case that I had dealt with property rights and overregulation of somebody's land because it was declared a wetland and he couldn't use it for any purpose at all, not even to build a little parking spots for a beach club. And today we have serious issues of entire businesses, entire industries being shut down. And how are you going to sue? Who are you going to sue? So these are very complex issues, and we're spending quite a bit of time looking into what some areas that can be challenged are, what areas make less sense for being challenged. But we think clearly there are some serious constitutional issues with governments not allowing people to open up, even when an industry or when a business can say, hey, we can do it. We can do it with social distancing. We can get the masks. We can get personal protection devices. We can keep our people apart, but at least they can go to work and earn a living, which is what's so important for so many people.
James, I never thought the day would come where actually wearing a mask would sort of be a freeing thing, because we could do more by just wearing it and going to work. I think that's the whole point. And I remember the CDC was talking about that. They abandoned that plan, didn't they? I feel like they just abandoned that plan.
Yeah, I mean, CDC, like everybody else, doesn't really know what to do. We've never had a
Right.
disease quite like this. There have been major pandemics in our history before. In 1918, we had the Great Flu, the so-called Spanish flu. It killed millions of people worldwide. But we knew so little about science back then compared to what we know today. And I think we're all very afraid of having the repeat of those number of deaths.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we don't want to be back in the Great Depression for until and if they come up with the vaccine. So we've learned a lot, but CDC is sometimes pretending to know a lot more than it does about what's the right course of action, what's the wrong course of action. People get it figured out pretty quickly. You recall, before the lockdown orders, people were starting to distance themselves. I started to stay away from the light rail in Sacramento. I decided to drive to work instead. And people were doing things like that, making their own choices all across the country. And people are now making other choices, saying, it's time for me to get out of the house, go back to work. There may be some risk, but it looks like the risk is manageable. Yeah. Coronavirus is a terrible, terrible thing to get, and it causes horrible consequences for some people. But at the same time, not having a job, not having enough food to put on the table, that also has serious consequences.
It's disaster waiting to happen. Now, your state, California, because you're right in the thick of it in San Jose, your state seemed to be very confused on what they wanted to do, essential versus non-essential. Are you seeing an aftermath of that, and are you seeing any legal challenges that you guys are dealing with all those decisions made early on?
Well, we are starting up some legal challenges. We've written a letter, for example, just last week, the first step in a potential lawsuit against the Judicial Council, because they simply banned all courts from opening up for evictions. Now, I can understand that some people may have lost their jobs as COVID-19 and they need some kind of relief, but there are simply no evictions possible. A lot of people who have jobs said, hey, I don't have to pay the rent because I'm getting this free rent trick from the state of California, and nobody is allowing a unlawful detainer, an eviction action to proceed. Well, if somebody doesn't pay the rent for several months and they can pay it, you ought to be able to go to court to prove that. And that's not possible right now. So that's one avenue of potential litigation. Other times, other litigation out there that we're looking at very carefully deals with some of the more draconian orders as far as free speech, assembly, that kind of thing. We think that the panic reaction can somewhat be excused 2 months ago, but to continue this into the future is making less and less sense.
So what is your advice to, because you guys are beyond the Pacific Coast, you're all over the place. So what's your advice? How are you advising states even to open up right now at the Pacific Legal Foundation?
I would say that you've got to have a balancing, looking at the rights on one side that are being limited or destroyed, the inability to go to work, the inability to go to church, and then look at what you're going to get from that. Is this really justify the emergency powers that the governors have been asserting and some local governments have been asserting? And I would say in some cases, the balance is no longer there. We've learned enough that we know that we ought to be looking much more carefully at what the real risks are in a particular community. Every community is different. Every community has to be looked at differently. We are all, thank God, not New York City. You could be up in the middle of Montana, the middle of Idaho, and it's a much different problem. People living in rural areas, look, they've been social distancing for their entire lifetime. They're ready for this, right? I mean, they just have to be careful when you get together for going to church or something like that. But people are willing to be careful. No, nobody wants to get the COVID-19 disease. They want to be careful about it. But at the same time, in some areas of the country, if it's not rational, then you're subject to being challenged in court.
I haven't had a legal expert on to talk about this, but the Dallas salon owner, it's still, I'm twisted with that because at the same time you want to abide by the law, but What did you think of that case overall and how that was handled?
Well, I mean, insanity takes many forms, right? So here we had a salon owner that wanted to carefully open her salon a few days ahead of time. And apparently the court, the local government officials and the court thought it would be perfectly okay to send her to jail for 7 days for violating the order. But I guess it made sense because they had let out so many criminals out of the jails. They had extra room, I guess, and they had to fill them up again. I mean,
Isn't that
the
sad?
whole thing is like Franz Kafka, one of these absurd novels of the early 20th century. I mean, it makes no sense. Now, here is a case where if people just got together and said some common sense, okay, she opened a few days early, maybe you could, tisk tisk, give her $100 fine saying don't do it again, but send her to jail for 7 days where it's only going to increase her risk of getting something in jail and coming back out and spreading that around where you're letting criminals out at the same time. I mean, honest to God, convicted criminals are being let out early so
Yep.
they don't get sick. Oh, that's a choice that you can make, but be consistent. I mean, you're treating a hairdresser worse than a criminal? Come on.
Oh, well, and even here in New York, we're seeing social distance ambassadors now. Like we're had to be told to be social distance by someone else. It's almost anarchic, and it is feeling fascist right now. I mean, I can't say it any other way.
Well, look, you go to China and they've developed this thing called social credit, where if you're a good person and you stand up and cheer when the national anthem is being played in China, then you get high social credit marks. But if you grumble a bit or complain or write a nasty letter on WeChat or something like that, then your social credit goes down and you have fewer rights to travel, fewer rights to a good job, and that kind of thing. And are we getting to that point where all of the neighbors are going to be paid to snitch on other neighbors? When I was growing up, we'd hear about these things happening in Soviet Union and Cuba where neighbors would snitch on other neighbors about not following the party line or having a few more extra grains of rice than somebody else and they're supposed to. And we're getting to that point now. Look, if I want to go out without a mask, I'm stupid if I wanted to do that. I think it's a good idea to have a mask in certain places, but it's not my neighbor's business to enforce that against me.
Right.
I mean, we are a country of individualists. We're a country based on the concept of individual freedom, not collective rights or collective freedom. And we need to realize that when we are a country of free people, we have to act like free people and we have to let people be free. And when you have a crisis, it's a great excuse for the totalitarian instinct in people to come in and take control and command things for the crisis, right? For the crisis. But every time we have a crisis, it's just a little harder to back away from that. We get a little more freedom taken away, a little more hard, a little more permanently. And the left says, well, we should never let a good crisis go to waste.
Right.
I say we should use this crisis as an opportunity for more freedom rather than less.
Well, we're talking with James Burling. He's the Vice President of Legal Affairs at Pacific Legal Foundation. Thanks for joining me on this pod. A lot of good stuff, and you got all this experience. I love hearing about it from you directly. So, James, have you gotten word from Michigan? Have you gotten anybody from Michigan ready to sue Governor Whitmer?
Well, people already have sued. We're not involved in those lawsuits, but some other people have sued, and I've looked at some of that litigation. And it does make sense. Now, quite true, everybody realizes these cases are not going to be easy because you're oftentimes dealing with courts that have a certain sympathy for government action. A lot of judges are former government lawyers, former politicos, if you will, who are very dialed into the system. And it's a little difficult for a number of judges to say that, hey, maybe the government, maybe the state or the county is acting wrong and I should rule against them. But some of the cases do have some merit because when the conditions that are being imposed lack a rational basis, when lack any kind of procedural due process. And what I mean by procedural due process is you should have the ability of going to court and saying, or first of all, going to your local government saying, this restriction on me is too severe, it doesn't make any sense, and I want an opportunity to have an exception for me, for my business, so that I can prove that we can operate my business safely. We can keep social distancing. We can make sure that people are wearing masks. We can put up plexiglass partitions between some of the workers. There's a whole variety. We can stagger shifts. We can do all kinds of things. But if there's no opportunity, a meaningful opportunity to go in and prove that you can operate effectively that way, then it becomes something of a violation of due process. We have here in California, Elon Musk, you may have just heard this recently.
Yeah.
He's trying to get the Tesla plant reopened. Now, I'm a lukewarm fan of Elon Musk because he is somebody who is awfully happy to feed at the government trough when it's convenient. But he put together a plan where he thought he could reopen the plant, and it was simply turned down. And he's pretty unhappy about that. He says, well, if I ever do any more manufacturing, it's not going to be in California. It's going to be in Texas or a friendlier state. Now, I've been saying that for years. Who in their right mind would open up a business in California? Well, Elon Musk did because he was getting tons of subsidies, quite frankly, from the state government. But better than that, so if he's ticked off at California, you better imagine that people are pretty unhappy with governments. And I think Michigan is a classic example of that. California is another one.
Well, I've got to ask you, because a lot of people are also directing their anger at China. And we're starting to see at least one state do it where they sued China. Anybody gutsy enough to, do it in California? Has anybody brought that idea up yet?
Of suing China in California, or having China sue California? I mean, California sue China?
Yeah, any talk of that from not liberals, obviously, but.
No, there aren't too many people talking about suing China here to try to get some kind of relief. It's a sort of thing you would file a lawsuit against China to make political points, perhaps, or to make a statement. But the law that's going to allow you to sue China and try to get any relevant information out of the Chinese, that's going to be really, really difficult, because the Chinese, it's a totalitarian society in many ways. It's not completely totalitarian like it used to be, I guess, but it's getting more and more returning to that.
Yeah.
And they don't have a Freedom of Information Act request. You're simply not going to file a lawsuit against them and try to engage in discovery and get their documents about who knew about the disease and when, who knew at the lab outside of Wuhan what was going on, or there are all sorts of many questions everybody would love to have answered from China. Problem is, China's not going to answer those questions, and us suing them isn't going to make them answer thing any quicker than anything else. And if you were to sue with a favor, with a friendly judge here in California or anywhere else in the United States, what are you going to do? Get money from the Chinese? You're going to ask the Chinese to what? Give up Shanghai or something? It's not very realistic. So I think it's the sort of thing that might make somebody feel good, but as far as the legal potential of having a successful suit against China, I think it's just as likely that China is going to become an open democratic society in the next 2 weeks.
Hey, James, you just mentioned, the court's over in California. The Ninth Circuit is a very famous one. What changes have you seen on the Ninth Circuit the last few years? Anything improving over there? And have they ruled against businesses during this time as well?
Oh, by all means. Yeah, I mean, look, you've taken the Ninth Circuit, which has gone from absolutely atrocious to merely bad. And that's tremendous progress here in California, because we've had a lot of new judicial appointments by President Trump. And those new judicial appointments are, without question, excellent choices for the Ninth Circuit. Now, we still have a majority of appointees from prior administrations who are less favorable to a more freedom-oriented look at how to interpret laws in a less original view, and they can get the majority. But in a court as large as California, where you have over 30 judges, you have 3-judge panels that will be on your initial case. And so your odds of getting 2 judges on a 3-judge panel that have rational ways of looking at how to interpret statutes in the Constitution is much greater. You're much more likely to get a rational court than you were just a few years ago. And if you have a decision that goes the wrong way, you can ask for the entire Ninth Circuit to rehear the case in what's called an en banc panel. And there your odds are much better of that happening. Now, it's still, we still have a ways to go. We've had 4 years of pretty good appointments and many years of very bad appointments. And for various statistical reasons, a vast expansion during the Jimmy Carter years has carried on from Democratic president to Democratic president, and only now has that logjam been broken. So I'm optimistic about the Ninth Circuit. A lot of what the future is going to hold will depend on what happens in November. And I'm not talking about a resurgence of the coronavirus. I'm talking about a resurgence of the left-wing liberal bias in the White House and Senate.
Speaking of that, in November, your governor just did mail at home. Is there a danger with that, mail at home voting?
You know, California is one of the few states where vote harvesting is legal. You may have recalled the little blow up in North Carolina a couple of election or two ago, where a Republican had been found to have had some of his operatives were collecting mail-in ballots and then submitting them en masse. That's illegal in North Carolina, but it's perfectly legal in California. And we had instances where poll workers were dropping off, or politicos in the Democratic Party were dropping off hundreds of mail-in ballots. That was legal, but certainly way open to abuse. Now, the next election, it's all going to be mail-in. Now, we had that option before of doing it all mail-in as well, and everybody was actually had received a mail-in ballot, but they still could go to the polling place to drop off their ballots. But that's not going to be an option anymore. So the challenge of vote harvesting is who's going to be out there harvesting the votes and who's going to be checking on that. And I think it's a system that is just going to be subject to potential abuse. It will be abused. I mean, look, elections in this country are free and fair, but we all know for a long time, many people who are very ambitious, if you will, would buy votes. There's walking around money in some of the major urban centers where people would buy votes. And part of the ban on ballot harvesting, which is going around to a whole bunch of people and collecting their absentee ballots, was to prevent votes from being bought and sold. Well, that's legal in California. I say it shouldn't be, but the people who control this state think it's a dandy idea. They say this is going to help the poor and the minorities to vote because we're making it easy as possible that anybody can vote. Somebody can show up at your door and say, hey, would you like to vote? Yeah, but I'm too tired to get out. That's okay. I have a form to fill out. You just want to sign your name? What if I sign your name for you, right? Who's going to figure it out? And California is far to the left, and things like this are just going to keep it there.
Has Pacific Legal dealt with something like that? Have you guys had any cases with vote harvesting issues?
No, we haven't had a case of vote harvesting because, as I said, under California law, vote harvesting is legal. And we would love to get the legislature to change that, but the legislature has no inclination to change that because vote harvesting helps the status quo. Instead, we are one of the only states where vote harvesting is legal. We are an outlier, but then again, California is an outlier in so many other things. And what I think the more serious problem is, because California is a lost cause, right? But other states where people are advocating for more access to voting booths through mail-in voting, look at and make sure that they're not going to, at the same time, slip in a weakening of the restrictions against vote harvesting. The idea that some people just can't get together 50 cents or a stamp and mail in, well, they're stamp free anyway. They're usually
Right.
free in most places. But some people just simply won't have the ability to open up a ballot and mark the X's and send it in. So they need help. And if you hear that we're going to have a program to help people vote, watch out, because if you have mail-in votes and helping people vote, you are going to have fraud. And so be careful when this movement tries to sweep away from California into the rest of the country. As I said, we're a lost cause, but not all the other 49 states are as far off as we are.
Well, James, I know that it's kind of tough to have legal issues there if everything is legal, right? So the challenges, from what you're saying, seem to be far and few between. So what are you guys working on to protect liberty and not have the total erosion of it in California?
Well, not so much with the voting issues, because I said that's probably, but what we are focusing on in California deals a lot with property rights. The ability of government to stop you from using your property if you want to build a home or a small apartment complex. We are challenging that. We're challenging the ability of government to demand extortion in exchange for your ability to use your property. And I use that term deliberately when I say extortion, because we had a case against the California Coastal Commission a number of years ago, where the Coastal Commission said that if you want a permit to rebuild a home, you have to give to us some of your property. And we had a case where the Coastal Commission was asking for a third of somebody's land in exchange for a permit. That went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court called that an out plan of extortion and said, no, you can't do that, because you haven't shown that developing this home creates a need for the public to have a third of your property. We had a similar case in Florida just a few years ago, where a local government in Florida was asking somebody to spend about $250,000 to fix drainage on government property about 5 miles away from the development site. Somebody wanted to build some small set of stores, and he was told he had to spend $250,000 to help fix property down the street. And they were saying, well, the case that we won in California, that was for land. We're only asking for money here. And we won that case in the Supreme Court as well.
Congratulations.
But nevertheless, governments continue to try to find ways of extorting things out. Oh, in that case out of Florida, the Supreme Court referred to it as extortion about 6 times in the decision. So I'm not making that word up. The court saw it for what it was. But some courts are trying to find loopholes in those decisions, and so they find a loophole, we go to court to close that loophole.
Hey, have you got any cases from New York? Because clearly you're Pacific Legal, but you're nationwide. So any New York cases you can update us on?
We've had some cases in New York. We've been involved in New York City with Mayor de Blasio, who's been trying to eliminate some of the exceptional schools that New Yorkers have for the gifted students. And de Blasio is saying that, well, look, not enough of certain minorities go to these schools, so we have to change the criteria to make sure we get more minorities. But it's one kind of minority versus another kind of minority, because Asian students who have been working particularly hard to get into these students have had a great deal of success. And Mayor de Blasio doesn't apparently like that. He'd rather have other minorities get some of those coveted spots as well. And we think this kind of racial discrimination has no place in America. It hasn't had any place in America since 1865, when we had a war to stop that kind of racial stereotyping and racial discrimination. And so we are relying on constitutional amendments that were adopted in the wake of the Civil War to say, Mayor de Blasio, you can't do this. Those cases are proceeding apace, and I hope to have some progress to report in due course.
Please do, because it sounds like that case is ongoing right now. Is that right?
That is correct.
So we will definitely, and you know what's interesting is because now almost every turn you see him, he always wants to combat anti-hate crimes against anybody. But as you say, trying to withhold people from a good education is a hate crime, in my opinion. Maybe yours too.
Yeah, it's unconscionable that if you have a kid who just works his rear end off, studies really, really hard, works really, really hard in order to get a place in one of these coveted schools. And no doubt, this kid's parents are behind him, breathing down his or her neck
Yeah.
every inch of the way, because we all know without parents really pushing kids, a lot of kids will say, hey, I'd much rather play on my video game instead. So you have a
Mm.
lot of parents that are making a lot of sacrifices of time and effort to get their kids to work hard. They get it. They deserve to be in the places that they work for. Now, I understand that there are minority communities where it's difficult because you don't have the strong two-parent households that you may have in other communities.
Right.
But there are better ways of dealing with those kind of issues, like fixing the schools that are there now,
Yeah.
giving those kids more opportunities. If you think there should be more excellent schools, then create more excellent schools so
Definitely.
all kids can have excellent schools. We don't have a shortage of good ideas. What we have a shortage of will on the part of education officials to say, we need to have accountability. We need to have an ability in New York City to get rid of teachers who are not performing. We need to have discipline instilled in our schools that is lacking right now because we're too afraid to impart discipline because that may have an adverse impact on a child's psyche. Well, what about the other 29 kids in the classroom that are dealing with this kid that won't control himself?
Right.
I think it's time that we make sure that all kids are given the maximum opportunity to succeed rather than letting a few bad kids or bad teachers drag everybody down.
Well, don't tell anybody, okay? But I hate rubber rooms just as much as anybody else. And I'm not supposed to say that in New York, but I just do. Uh, so, James, I got to ask you then, are you close with Eva Moskowitz? Like, have you worked with her on all of this?
No, I have not. But we will work with anybody who does good stuff. But I just have not yet had that opportunity.
Because she is a staunch supporter of charter schools, as you probably well know.
Yes.
So,
And I think, and charter schools are, it's funny and ironic in a lot of ways. You look at the support that charter schools had at one time across the political spectrum from Democrats and Republicans. But then some of the teacher unions, quite frankly, decided that they didn't like charter schools because it had an adverse impact on them. It might create accountability in the teaching ranks.
yeah.
And they've come on, I think, highly irrationally against the idea of charter schools where they should be welcoming competition. I mean, look, I'm in the law business and competition is good. It keeps us on our toes.
Yep.
You're in the broadcasting business. Competition is good for you. It would be nice you think one hand, if I was the only broadcaster doing podcasts out there, everybody would listen to me. It would be perfect. But the competition keeps you on your toes. And schools are no different. Competition keeps schools on their toes. Yeah, competition is hard. Competition can create stress, but you know what? Stress can create good things. If you got to be looking behind your back and figuring, well, who's coming up behind me? I might have to run harder. I might have to work harder.
Yep.
Well,
Yep.
that's good, and that's what's a good thing for kids.
James, and I still feel like a kid at podcasting, so I'm always trying to keep at this. But James, I gotta ask you, so 1619, this whole New York Times essay about back then, the slavery, I don't know if you're into it or not, but it's now going to be in public schools. So you might see challenges to that too, the curriculum changing.
Well, it's, first of all, the 1619 project, I think a vast number of reasonable, non-ideological historians have looked at that and said it's just a load of nonsense. I mean, you can look at articles in Wall Street Journal on down and a number of other places, left and right, have said, we don't think so. But it is so politically correct that we can, because there is a move to do whatever you can to denigrate capitalism, to denigrate the entrepreneurial spirit that has made this country great. And if you are an anti-capitalist, if you don't like capitalism, you'd rather have a form of socialism, and a lot of people apparently think that's not a bad idea, including a presidential candidate who may or may not give up, then the 1619 project is perfect. But we have so much indoctrination going in our public schools, which is why I think you have a charter school movement, which is why there's a homeschooling movement.
Yeah.
And that's why there's a pushback against homeschooling, by people who, there's an article that was just put in a prestigious journal a little while ago complaining that the problem with homeschool is that children don't get exposed to this multi-dimensional sexual orientation, blah, 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 blah. But that's something that parents should choose. Whether you agree or don't agree with those sort of moral judgments and moral values, that's something that parents should be able to choose. And if parents want to homeschool, that's the parents' rights. What's important is that kids get a good education. And kids get a good education in charter schools. They get a good education in homeschools. They get a good education in some public schools. But give parents a choice. Parents are not stupid. They love their kids and they want what's best for their kids, and they want their kids to be raised in an environment that instills the values that those parents believe in. Then parents should certainly be free to do that.
And by the way, we're just seeing a whole positive thing about the e-learning, that the parents now know what the kids are doing with their classes, and that is a good thing, I think. Because why would you want to pay for your kid to have a class and not know what's going on in it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be rather eye-opening if parents are listening to some of this indoctrination that goes on in some of the classrooms. Like, I remember when our kid was small and he would bring home the textbooks, and I would look at the indoctrination in them, and I would just roll my eyes and I say, Tommy, it's not necessarily real. It's just dreams about kids and polluting the world, and the world is coming to an end because they threw away a paper wrapper in the wrong place. I mean, just heavy-handed political, ideological, particular moral viewpoint indoctrination in some of the schools. In California, I'll get back to my adopted home state, is particularly notorious in that so many things have to be learned. You have to talk about the sexual orientation of the people in history. Like, who cares? One way or the other. But apparently some people do, but that's not, they should be teaching reading and writing and arithmetic, mathematics, science, all kinds of things that they're not teaching well enough. And we put this other stuff on top. I don't know. I'm glad my kid is grown now. He's grown up, and he thinks a lot like I think.
Well, and I do think, though, if you're going to go do a class, if you're going to have a class, you have to do it in a way that shapes the mind to get out of hatred, not anti-Semitism, not form that in the classroom, which is happening. I feel like kids are being bred to hate right now.
Yeah, you can't substitute one form of hatred for another, right? You can't say, well, we shouldn't hate Arabs. Absolutely, we should not hate Arabs, but that doesn't mean you have to hate Jews, right?
Exactly.
You shouldn't hate anybody. I mean, I was raised that we should love thy neighbor as thyself. Every great religion has that strong moral value that you have to love your neighbor as yourself, right?
Right.
The golden rule. And you don't get that if you start tearing down another culture, if you start tearing down various traditions. You can question traditions when they've done things wrong, and you need to point out when people do things that are wrong. But at the same time, don't destroy people in the process.
Don't make it your own specific diversity, which is the word they love to toss around. And yet you're reminding me that they do it by tearing down someone else. So it's not really diversity, is it?
It's not diversity. It's my diversity over your diversity, my tribe over your tribe. And my point is, all tribes are wonderful.
Yes.
But let's not tear down one tribe at the expense of the other. Let's build everybody up at the same time.
Hey, James, a couple more questions before we wrap up. First of all, are we in a constitutional crisis more than ever before? Like, is this COVID challenging the Constitution, like stretching it? And are the governors stretching it to what they believe they should stretch it to?
We have been in similar situations in the past. We had a great constitutional crisis at the Civil War, right? And that was resolved through the blood of hundreds of thousands of young men and some young women as well. We had a constitutional crisis of a form during the Great Depression, where a large number of command and control regulations are put in place, where contracts, many cases were torn up and rewritten. And we got through a lot of that. There's still some legacy of the Great Depression that has affected our freedom since then, but by and large, we survived. And now we have another crisis. And my concern is often it's a one-way ratchet. Every crisis just ratchets the freedom just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Big crisis, quite a bit more. And things are difficult to relax after the crisis is over. So whatever we're going to do with dealing with COVID-19, we have to make sure it's temporary. And one of the things that we've been trying to focus on and say, look, we have too many restrictions right now on your ability to open a business, on your ability to use your property, on your ability to earn a living without having to go through ridiculous licensing procedures. Now is a time where we should loosen up and make it easier for people to work, to have a business, because God knows we're going to need to get businesses back in the saddle. And we have had so many businesses that are being permanently wiped off the face of the earth that aren't coming back. And we need new businesses to replace them. So we need to use this opportunity not to have our freedoms permanently dialed back a little bit, but our freedoms permanently expanded to the status quo ante where they used to be before we created this regulatory state that we have now.
And so, as you talk about businesses and getting them open and everything, what can Pacific Legal do for the business person today to open up and open up constitutionally as well?
What we're looking at right now is those states that are not allowing any kind of flexibility. And we would love to get involved and help represent some businesses. We've had some talks with people in different parts of the country about this, saying, look, if you don't have an option of trying to prove that you can open up safely and you can do it in a manner that's not going to endanger public health and safety, you should be given that opportunity. And so we're looking at cases like that. We're looking at cases where other freedoms, such as freedom of speech, have been infringed upon. So I think there is going to be opportunities for those states that are too slow in getting back to business to dial back on some of the restrictions. So there very well could be litigation.
Well, and where can people reach you or reach the PLF? Where can we reach you?
So go to our website, pacificlegal.org. That's Pacific Legal, one word, .org. And there's a form on there for letting us know about your case and your issue. Look at it, fill it out, and spend some time going around the website. We have some interesting cases that we talk about, and we do it in terms that a non-lawyer can read and understand and actually enjoy. In other words, I didn't write it all. And so it's written in an accessible way. And so go to pacificlegal.org and take a look at it. And I think your listeners may find it not only entertaining, but also quite informative. And
you're inspiring me because, a lot of the time I want to just focus on the content, but what we're doing here and how you want to help, it just inspires me to tell people, do not sit back. You have options to really face this head on, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, and we certainly can't, we're a limited number of lawyers. We can't get involved in every case in every state, but good cases can be filed. And people should do what they can to assert their rights in a lawful and reasonable manner. Because if people don't stand up for their rights, who's going to do it, right? You just can't have somebody do it all for you. And if you are a business person or somebody trying to express yourself, somebody trying to practice your religion, and you think the restrictions are too harsh, that no longer make sense, then it's time to speak out. And that could speak out publicly, it could speak out on media, and it could mean speaking out in court by filing an action. James, I might have you back next week, as early as next week, because who knows what we could see out of New York once the reopening starts. It could be some issues right away on May 15th. So let's keep an eye on that. Absolutely. All right, James Burling, he is the VP of Legal Affairs at the Pacific Legal Foundation, pacificlegal.org. Thanks so much for joining tonight. My pleasure. Good talking with you. I'm Alex Garrett, and we will talk to you tomorrow. This was so good, James.